This is One on One. We have a one-on-two here. Richard Linnett is the author of In the Godfather Garden, the long life and times of Richie the Boot Boiardo, and Roger Hanos is grandson of Richie the Boot Boiardo. Good to have both of you here.
Thanks.
Thank you. Set this up for us. I grew up in Newark, New Jersey, in the North Ward of Newark, New Jersey, hearing about Richie Boiardo my entire life, even though he was not around for most of my life. Set it up. Who was Richie the Boot Boiardo, and why was he such an important figure in New Jersey and national mob history?
Well, Richie rose out of Prohibition, really. He was an immigrant from Naples, got here in 1906. Or was it 1901?
It was 1901.
1901, yes, 1901.
Became one
1901,
of the top
at the age
mobsters,
of 10.
Age of 10, became one of the top mobsters in the East Coast. I'll do the PBS faster version.
Okay, go ahead.
Became the inspiration for Tony Soprano's character in the HBO hit series of Sopranos, fair to say?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And lots of similarities there. And you grew up as a kid in the area, right?
Our family's from Vailsburg.
Yeah.
And then we moved out and went up to Roseland, which is right in the shadow of the estate of Richie the Boot in
Now,
Livingston.
how do you come into this whole thing, right? And how do you meet this guy?
Well, believe it or not, my mother calls from Florida. She's retired and says, hey, I heard there's an article in Penthouse magazine regarding Grandpa and Uncle Tony. And I said...
Uncle Tony would be Tony Boy.
Right.
Tony Boy, Richie Boiardo's son, who was also involved in that life. Go ahead.
Correct. So, read the article. I thought it was a great job. I contacted Rich Linnett and invited him over, proposed that we do a book together. And so we came to terms and collaborated on an agreement, and which resulted in the book. Rich was a great choice in terms of doing this because he was an established author, writer, and a journalist, and plus he had the same passion and determination as I did to tackle the project.
What's interesting, for those, some might assume that family members of organized crime figures would, whether you sign the vow of omerta or understand the vow of omerta, would say, well, it's a vow of secrecy that we would never, or is that just old and irrelevant and...
Well, it changed over the years. A lot of people, you know, Gotti's lieutenant, you know,
Sammy the Bull?
Sammy the Bull started talking. All these guys talk in the end. I mean, a lot of them talk
Yes.
in the end. But Roger was never in this life of theirs. He was never in it. In fact, the Boot made sure that his grandchildren were not in this life. His son was the heir apparent, and that was Tony Boy, and he got in it. And that often happened. It happened, of course, with the Corleone family and the Godfather.
Yes.
And there are parallels.
Even though they wanted Michael to go to a different way?
Exactly.
Senator Corleone, Governor Corleone, it didn't happen that way.
Didn't happen that way. But Roger did go a different way. But he happened to live on the estate that the Boot built in Livingston.
Yeah, talk about the estate. Some interesting things happened there.
It's about 30 acres up on a hill by Rikers Hill, right next to a Nike base, big mansion, lots of statues. It was profiled in a Life magazine article in 1967.
What are we looking at right there, by the way? That's a picture of?
That's Richie the Boot on his horse, a statue that's in the garden.
Yes.
In the garden. That's why it's in the Godfather Garden. That's the house, the main house. Can I play
Talk
off
about
the
it.
images?
Yeah.
That picture was what, from 1950?
1950.
Yeah, 1950. Right. So it was in great shape. Now it's fallen into disrepair. The property had like a little village with all of the houses where the children lived. His daughters lived, and Roger grew up there. So Roger grew up on the estate. He was the perfect person for me to get in touch with because, you know, some of the cousins had disappeared when other places. Roger grew up on the estate. He tended to Richie the Boot through the second half of his life, basically, and saw him on his deathbed.
You did?
Yes.
Well, let me ask you about this. Guys, we may go longer with this segment because I want to. It's interesting to me. You knew him obviously in a very different way than those of us who heard about him, who heard about the violence, who heard about the extortion, who heard about the mob connections that had politicians in his back pocket, like they used to talk about in The Godfather, about Vito Corleone, but also heard about what would go on at that estate, that some of the mob figures would say that you would not want to be brought into certain places in the back in the estate because you would not come out, and you wouldn't be killed in a kind way. You would be incinerated. You would be burned. That's the same man that you cared for in the second half of his life.
Yes.
Did you ever talk about those things?
No, no. My grandfather's life before, during, and after Prohibition remained a mystery to the immediate family.
Did you want to know?
Well, after I retired and finished my career, established my family, and yes, I had a major Ancestry.com moment, and Richard came along, and I took advantage of that.
But here's the thing: you have a different last name.
Yes, my mother is Richie Boiardo's daughter, Rosina Boiardo.
Okay.
He built a home for her on the estate, and we lived there.
Well, here's the thing I'm curious about, is having the Boiardo name, because Dr. Boiardo, Richie the Boot Boiardo's grandson, has sat in that chair to talk about orthopedics. We never talked about his grandfather. We never talked about the family lineage. We talk about medical and clinical issues. The Boiardo name, what do you think it represents?
Yeah, I mean, that's the you know, Dr. Boiardo, great guy, interviewed him for my article, great guy, didn't want to become involved in a book.
It was clear, I read the book, I was looking for his name, he was not there anywhere.
No, he did not want to be involved in it. And it's it's a little bit, it's a stigma that Richie,
a little bit of a stigma.
Richie did not grow up on the estate, though, the dock.
Yes.
Roger did. Roger was very close to the situation, even very close, having intimations that something was wrong there. Knew something about his grandfather, that he was a gangster, but not really knowing it all. Found out about it eventually, but he lived on the estate, so he was very, very close, and I think the doc wasn't quite as close. But that's two different grandsons.
So let me ask you this, because also the church that my sons actually wind up receiving their first Holy Communion in St. Lucy's Church, in the old First Ward of Newark. There is a stained glass window that I look up on. Actually, as we do this program this Sunday, as my son receives his first Holy Communion, Christopher, I'll be looking up on it. And the name there is Richard Boiardo. He was one of the biggest contributors, one of the biggest supporters of the church that sustained an Italian community where immigrants were poor, had nothing. He was, in many ways, the backbone of that church.
Absolutely right. We've always known him to be very charitable with churches, and especially St. Lucy's.
Is that a contradiction to be this person who was involved in murder, extortion, and everything he was doing, but still be a part of the church, tied to what they were doing, and trying to help poor people?
Absolutely. For whatever reasons, he was able to compartmentalize his secret life and his family life and the community life. And I don't know how he was able to do that without spilling over in each of the areas.
But he did.
Yeah.
Vittorio Castle was what your father owned. He owned it. He actually sold it to someone who I wound up knowing, Tom Panulo. It's so interesting, Tom's Restaurant. But Vittorio Castle was a place that Joe DiMaggio would come from New York to want to be comfortable with friends. He owned it. It was a place to be, no?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And I think you're referring to Vittorio Castle prior to the Sorrento. Tom Panulo took over the Sorrento restaurant.
Yes. Describe Vittorio Castle. What was it, and how grand was it?
Well, from what I heard and saw, it was grand to the extent where everyone wanted to be married there, have their events there. The food was fantastic. It was also a place where you could rub shoulders with the gangsters, with a load of celebrities.
Celebrities had discovered Newark at that time. North Newark became like a mecca for people who were, been in New York, been in Manhattan, been all those places. They discovered the North Ward of Newark, Italian neighborhood, great restaurants. That place was where Laurel and Hardy went, where Joe DiMaggio, a lot of celebrities
Sinatra knew
went.
It as well.
Yeah, Sinatra was there.
But the other side of this is that Richie Boiardo and Gerard Cattina and Gyp DiCarlo and others who were part of that milieu also knew that one of the keys was to control the political figures in the city of Newark. And one of those political figures was you, Adubato, who was the mayor of the city of Newark, who was convicted, went to jail. They owned him. They controlled him. They owned the city. Describe the connection between Richie Boiardo, those guys, and the politicians in the city.
Well, there was that was Tony Boy's initiative, the Newark
Tony Boy
Adubato.
Boiardo.
Tony Boy Boiardo. At that point, Richie was kind of like, he retired in '58 supposedly, and gave the street activity to his son. His son got involved with the people who basically started doing sweetheart deals through a company called Valentine Electric, which he was associated with, and started, winning these bids.
Rigging these bids.
Rigging these bids, right.
But hold on, was the key that Tony Boiardo learned from his father was that you had to control political figures in order to move commerce, meaning Richie Boiardo was involved in moving liquor illegally during Prohibition, and as was Joe Kennedy and others, no secret, watch Boardwalk Empire. Point being, Tony Boy learned from his father and others around him that you had to control political figures in order to move
Yes.
commerce. Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely fair assessment. Yes.
So talk about what happened.
So it's interesting when you bring that up with Richie, because Richie had the Modern Political Association, which was basically a club that was a hangout for his gang, and it also was a way to get money to support the candidates that he was behind, including Paul Moore, who was a congressman, Jersey congressman, who showed up at this big 3-day party that celebrated the truce between Richie and the other gangster in New York, Abe Longies Willman. So during that 3-day event, politicians showed up, cops showed up, judges showed up, and some of them lost elections after they were photographed, including Paul Moore. And Richie figured that out early, and he passed his knowledge on to his son. And his son brought it to this high level where in 1969, when it was discovered that Adubato and this whole ring of corruption had basically taken over the city.
Excuse me, which also included the director of the police department, Dominic Spina. Go
exactly.
ahead.
They basically drained the public coffers of funds. And that was, especially the New York Times, which investigated, said that was one of the reasons why the riots had occurred in '67, because there was no safety net anymore, because gangsters were sucking the lifeblood out of the city. And the city of Newark burned, and 26 people died during that.
So in many ways, what happened in Newark in 1967, according to many, was the culmination of that corruption leading up to that.
Yeah, it was that and race issues because of the influx of Southern blacks into the city, which created, and then diaspora of Italians and Germans out into the suburbs, like my family.
Absolutely, my family stayed. Yeah. But let me ask you this, and they're not going anywhere. but let me ask you this: as someone who grew up in that neighborhood, as someone who grew up hearing the stories, I want to ask you, because my last name ends in a vowel, yours happens not to, but you understand where I'm going with this. Do you understand some Italian Americans believing that Richie the Boot Boiardo and Tony Boy Boiardo and others who were involved in that life and the corruption, the crime, the murder, the extortion and everything, that beyond what people believe the Godfather and the Sopranos and all that is about, that they've made it hell on the rest of us?
Yes.
Do you get that?
Yes, I do get that. I'm also half Italian, and I grew up believing that my grandfather was the Robin Hood. Took from the rich, gave to the poor. But after doing the research on the book, working with Richard, there's a lot more to it than that, a whole lot more to it. The amount of crime, corruption, the killings, shocking, absolutely
brutal
shocking.
Killings.
And it's not just during the last 20 years of my grandfather's reign, but going back to the 20s and the 30s, it's just mayhem.
Has it been worse for you to know more? But the more you knew, more you have wound up knowing. Has it been worse for you emotionally and psychologically?
Yes, not only that, but in terms of the betrayal factor. I mean, I grew up with a unwritten code of silence. Don't ever talk about your grandfather, say anything bad. I mean, everyone that I spoke with praised my grandfather. Of course, I'm the grandson. I mean, it hurts to have to say this, but he chose a life, a secret life that that is not right. It's wrong. It was wrong.
It's interesting though, when he came, he comes over from Italy. There are hard times in the United States. A lot of people came over from Italy, and there's prohibition, and they see a way to start making money, and they get involved in that life.
No,
and
respectfully, my grandfather came in 1919.
Yeah.
He chose to be a barber and work in a factory. So when you say they, I just want to be clear.
Right. My grandfather too, on my mother's side, Moretti.
So
also
go ahead.
the same side. A Mason coming to Newark.
So go ahead.
And working totally legitimately.
Right. I just want to be clear because you seem to be going in a certain direction.
I'm not
like there was no other way.
Yeah. No, there is another way.
There was,
one of the reasons why everybody's attracted to these stories is these guys consider themselves soldiers, like the guys going to Afghanistan. They put themselves in that mind frame. This is a world in which we get things done. We don't have laws. We have some laws. We don't have judges. We don't have lawyers. We get things done either by sitting down or whacking the other guy.
For the baker,
and
for the butcher, and for the shoemaker, if they didn't pay these guys, they had problems with the same people who would bust their windows and tear down their businesses.
Yeah.
So what are you talking about?
I'm not justifying it.
But
I'm
you
just
make
saying,
it sound like somehow they were protecting them against someone else. They were protecting them against themselves because they were the ones who were going. If you didn't pay, if you didn't pay these guys came after you.
Right. No, and they're all bullies. I mean, I know myself. I'm just saying the attraction of this life, the attraction to this life.
The perception of the life versus the reality of it.
Right.
Could we acknowledge they're two different things?
Yeah.
Got The Sopranos, The Godfather. I watched every one of those movies, know way too many of the lines than I would like to admit. But the reality of the life is not the same as the Hollywood version.
Absolutely.
And you would say the same thing.
Yeah,
Even though I find your book, by the way, it is a must-read. In The Godfather Garden, The Long Life and Times of Richie the Boiardo. By the way, the scene with Marlon Brando in the garden with the grandson, with the orange peel, there's a reason for that. Yeah. I'm sorry for getting so emotionally connected to this.
And me too. I mean, we moved out of Newark, and when we moved out of
Newark. The air.
Newark.
By the way, go get the book. We'll keep talking off the air. Go ahead, say.
When we moved out of Newark, we were considered,
One-on-One with Steve Adubato has been a production of the CAUCUS Educational Corporation, celebrating 25 years of broadcast excellence. Funding for this edition of One-on-One with Steve Adubato has been provided by Wells Fargo, Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield of New Jersey, the New Jersey Education Association, New Jersey Council of County Colleges, New Jersey Manufacturers Insurance Group, PSE&G, and by Verizon Communications. Promotional support provided by The Star Ledger and NJ.com, and by the New Jersey Business and Industry Association. Transportation provided by Airbrook Limousine. One-on-One with Steve Adubato has been produced in partnership with St. Joseph's Healthcare System.